one of the things I'd like you to do is to compare a few countries with respect to some economic issue that you might think is interesting. What I'm going to do now is just show you how you can do that. It's a simple kind of an exercise. I'm going to use the Google Public Data website, and I'm going to select 3 countries. I'll select Australia, the United States and China, and I'm going to use the IMF database. The reason I'm going to use that is because the World Bank database is much more comprehensive. It has many more variables, but the drawback of that is that there are so many variables that it can be confusing if you're not familiar with all of the terminology. So we're going to use the IMF one because it's very simple. There's only a few variables to choose from, but it's not confusing at least. So I'm going to look at these 3 countries from the period 2000 to 2018 because the data only goes up to 2018 in this database. One warning is, if you go and do this for yourself and play around with it, just with your own countries, choose countries that you're interested in. You compare countries that you think would be interesting for you to compare. You should bear in mind that the web page can be a bit glitchy, so sometimes it gets stuck for some reason. You just refresh the whole page. Alright, so let's get to it. So here we are at the Google Public Data page. We're going to scroll down a little bit and we're going to find International Monetary Fund data. So here we are. Now, let's look at economic growth. So we're going to find economic growth. So let's go into national accounts. So we're looking for something like economic growth. So a gross domestic product, constant prices, percentage change. So that's the change in real GDP, production over time. So click on that. So far so good. That's showing for the world. I'm going to restrict this to 2000. So that's our time period, and I don't want the world. Alright, so we can see there that in terms of economic growth, in terms of increased production per year, Australia and the United States are pretty much on par. China is well ahead. It has a higher economic growth rate. We can notice that something happened in around about 2008, 2009. That was a global financial crisis, which hit the United States particularly hard. So the United States economic growth went negative. That is, production decreased by 2.8%. All right. So that's that. Now let's think about what could possibly contribute to or cause this. So one of the variables that economists regard as particularly important, as key to economic growth, is investment expenditure. So that's expenditure on the production of new equipment, factories, and so on. Investment is expenditure on goods and services that are devoted to the production of more goods and services. So let's look at investment as a percentage of GDP. Now we would expect that China, because of its higher growth rate, probably will have a higher rate of investment compared to Australia and the United States. Let's see. Yes, you can see there that of total GDP, China's is around about 43% of it is investment expenditure, which is huge. So this is possibly a major contributor to its economic growth. Australia is 28%, and the United States is 22% of GDP. Another factor which could contribute to economic growth is flows of income into and out of a nation, and we can see this in the current account balance of a country. A current account balance is a record of income in particular flowing into a country and out of a country due to trade, exports and imports, due to income from investments abroad or foreign investment within the country, and interest payments on loans. So let's see if we can find that. We've got balance of payments here, and in that there should be, yes. So the current account balance as a percentage of GDP. Okay, and what we see there is, in the case of Australia and the United States, they are negative, meaning that there is more money flowing out of Australia and the United States than is flowing in the form of trade, income from investments, and interest on loans. Whereas in the case of China, its current account balance is positive and is 3% of GDP, indicating that there is income flowing into China due to trade, income from investment expenditure from overseas, and interest payments on loans that have been made to other countries. So this contributes to China's economic growth. It helps contribute to China's economic growth, possibly why its economic growth rate is higher than Australia's or the United States. So at least a contributing factor. It's not the only explanation. Let's think about effects then. If a country has high economic growth, then you would expect that that country's unemployment rate will be relatively low. But you would also expect its inflation rate to be relatively high. So we would expect or predict, based on what I just said, that China would have a lower unemployment rate, at least in urban areas, than the United States and Australia, and would also have a higher inflation rate. So let's see if we can find unemployment. Under people, there we go, unemployment rate. So China has a lower unemployment rate now than both the United States and Australia up to this point. We should bear in mind, however, that in the case of all countries, but arguably, particularly in the case of China, the data is not necessarily reflecting reality completely. It might not be the case that the Chinese Bureau of Statistics is collecting all of the data on the number of people who are unemployed, or what an economist would regard as being unemployed. So it might neglect rural areas, for example, where there could conceivably be higher levels of unemployment than in cities. Anyway, what about inflation? Let's see if we can find inflation. There we go. So this is percentage change in average consumer prices. We can see there that China's inflation rate is slightly higher than Australia's and the United States'. Just as I predicted. Of course, I've checked this before I did any of this. Spoiler, I'm not some kind of oracle. Anyway, that's an example of the sort of thing you can muck around with to see what you can find for yourself for whatever countries you happen to be interested in.